Welcome. Over the next 45 minutes I want to walk you through a piece of research about how presidents actually decide under pressure, not in the abstract, but in one concrete, high-stakes case. The title is, Crisis Decision-Making in U.S. Foreign Policy, the 2026 Trump Administration's Iran Ceasefire and Nuclear Negotiations. Here's the situation in one breath. In the spring of 2026 the United States held overwhelming military advantage over Iran. And yet, in a Situation Room meeting at the end of May, the administration chose not to press that advantage toward unconditional victory. It chose instead to convert military dominance into a 60-day, time-bound diplomatic framework. That choice is the puzzle. A leader who is winning militarily decides to stop winning and start negotiating. Why? This paper takes that single decision and runs it through 5 different theories of foreign policy decision-making, asking which one best survives rigorous testing. The argument I'll build is that the most powerful explanation is not raw strategy, and not the usual story about reputation and threats. It's domestic political economy, specifically, what an oil shock does to the political sustainability of a war. By the end I'll offer a general proposition that travels well beyond Iran, that the durability of any coercive instrument depends on who bears its cost, and whether that cost is diffuse or concentrated. Let me set up the puzzle properly, because the whole analysis hangs on appreciating just how strange this decision looks at first glance. Picture the room, the 29th of May, 2026. A president who holds decisive military advantage convenes his national security principles to make what's described as a final determination. And the question on the table is not the usual one. It is not, how do we press this advantage to victory? It is, remarkably, whether to stop. 3 features make this genuinely puzzling. First, escalation dominance. The strikes had landed, there was an air campaign, there was a naval blockade in place. The United States could, by any military logic, have kept going. Second, an oil price shock. Brent crude had surged toward $126 a barrel, and gasoline had hit 4-year highs at home, in American gas stations, in an election-conscious environment. Third, this was a decision made under real pressure, and it ended without a triumphant public announcement. The choice was real, consequential, and quiet. So here is the question that organizes everything that follows. Why convert overwhelming military dominance into a 60-day diplomatic framework, rather than demand the capitulation that the balance of forces would seem to allow? Most people's intuition reaches for one of 2 answers. Either, he's just being strategic, or, it's all about looking tough. I'm going to show you that both of those intuitions, while not worthless, are surprisingly weak when you actually test them against the evidence. The better answer lies in the price of gasoline, and what that price does inside a democracy. Before diving in, let me justify why this one decision deserves an entire study. 3 reasons make it what methodologists call a critical case. First, it's a high-information event. Unusually, the principal narrated his own conditions and reasoning in something close to real time, through public statements and declaratory signaling. That gives us a rich record of bargaining language that we rarely get while a crisis is still live. Second, this is a case where coercion meets the oil market directly. It's a nuclear dispute fused with a maritime choke point crisis at the Strait of Hormuz. Because of that fusion, the domestic political economy of coercion becomes visible, literally visible, in prices at the pump. Most coercion cases don't let you see the home front cost so cleanly. Here you can read it off the markets day by day. Third, and this is methodologically valuable, we have a within-actor comparison available. The same administration ran a very different Iran strategy in 2018 to 2020, the so-called maximum pressure campaign. That holds a lot of leadership variables constant, same key personalities, similar worldview, similar partisan environment. So when behavior differs across the 2 episodes, we can ask what structural feature changed. That's a far stronger inferential setup than comparing 2 completely different leaders in 2 different countries. Put those 3 together, a high-information event, coercion fused with the oil market, and a built-in within-actor comparison, and you have a case that can actually discipline theory rather than just illustrate it. That's the difference between a war story and research. Now, a crucial point about evidence, because a skeptical listener should be asking, how much of this is solid, and how much is speculation about a fast-moving event? I want to be very precise, because the components of this case do not all have the same evidentiary status, and it would be intellectually lazy to hedge them all the same way. So I separate 3 categories. First, confirmed events. The strikes, Iran's closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the US air campaign and naval blockade, the Pakistan-mediated ceasefire, and the existence of the 29th of May Situation Room meeting. These are corroborated by official documentation and by multiple named wire services. I treat them as established fact, not conjecture. Second, reported but hedged internals. A narrow set of details, the precise terms of the draft Memorandum of Understanding, the reported $500 million per day blockade cost figure, and the closed-door advisory dynamics, these are attributed to specific outlets and flagged with, reportedly. Third, the genuinely open element, the final determination itself. Its existence, its terms, and its durability are treated as projected, not as data, because at the time of writing the President had not announced it. Why does this matter so much? Because it tells you exactly where the analysis is probing and where it is standing on firm ground. The events are solid. What is inferred, and therefore what I subject to structured testing, is the causal explanation, why the administration decided as it did. The reasoning is the object of the probe. The facts are the foundation. So let me state the research question formally, because precision here pays off later. Which model of foreign policy decision-making best explains the administration's choice to convert military escalation into a time-bound diplomatic framework, rather than press for unconditional capitulation? Notice what that question is and isn't. It is not, what happened. We've established what happened. It is, which theoretical mechanism best accounts for why the choice took the shape it did. Here is the roadmap for answering it. Step 1. I lay out 5 models of decision-making, 5 different lenses on the same event. Step 2. I add a 6th contender, a rival explanation drawn from a different tradition, because a fair test needs a strong adversary. Step 3. I subject all of them to explicit diagnostic tests, the kind that can fail a theory, not just flatter it. Step 4. I examine the evidence, model by model. Step 5. I run a comparison, including that within actor contrast and an out-of-actor case I'll introduce later. And Step 6. I draw out the theoretical contribution, the generalizable proposition. I'll flag one thing now that I think is important for honesty. The contribution does not depend on how the case ultimately resolves. Even if the settlement collapses tomorrow, the proposition about cost structure stands or falls on its own logic and on the comparative evidence. The argument is built to outlive the headline. With the question and the roadmap set, let's meet the 5 lenses. Here are the 5 analytical lenses, each a serious tradition in the study of foreign policy. First, the rational actor model. It treats the state as unitary and value maximizing. The leader presses leverage until marginal cost meets marginal gain, then stops at the optimum. Clean, powerful, and the natural first guess. Second, bureaucratic-politics. Its famous slogan is, where you stand depends on where you sit. Outcomes here are not a single mind optimizing but the product of bargaining among officials and agencies with different institutional interests. Third, prospect theory, drawn from behavioral psychology. It says choices are judged against a reference point, and crucially that people are risk-averse when they're in a domain of gains but risk-seeking when they're facing losses. The framing of the situation drives the risk appetite. Fourth, and this will become the star of the show, poliheuristic theory. It describes a 2-stage decision process. In the first stage, the leader eliminates any option that is unacceptable on a critical dimension, often the domestic political dimension, regardless of that option's other merits. Only in the second stage does the leader optimize among the options that survived the first cut. Eliminate first, then optimize. Fifth, groupthink and its modern cousin polythink. Groupthink is about excessive cohesion producing premature consensus. Polythink is the opposite pathology, too much fragmentation producing incoherent signaling. Both degrade the quality of decisions, just from opposite directions. 5 lenses, 1 decision. The discipline of the paper is to ask which of these survives genuine testing, not which one merely sounds plausible after the fact. Because almost any of them can be made to fit a story. Fitting is cheap. Surviving a test is what counts. Now I add the 6th contender, and I do it deliberately, because the strongest way to test your own argument is to pit it against the best available rival, not a straw man. The rival is audience cost theory, one of the most influential ideas in international relations, associated with James Fearon, with experimental work by Michael Toms, and resting on Robert Putnam's logic of 2-level games. The core claim is elegant. When a leader makes public threats and commitments in a crisis, they generate domestic audience costs, the political price of being seen to back down. Having staked their credibility publicly, leaders are pushed to hold firm, because retreating after a public commitment is humiliating and electorally costly. Now watch what that predicts here. The president had publicly demanded that Iran never acquire a weapon and that the strait reopen. Audience cost logic says those public commitments should push the terms of any settlement up. They should harden the leader's position and make settling cheaply very costly politically. That's the divergent prediction, and it's precisely the opposite of what polyheuristic theory predicts. The polyheuristic account says a domestic cost dimension, the oil shock, pushes the terms down towards settlement. So we have two theories pointing in opposite directions on the same observable. Does public commitment harden the terms, or does domestic economic pain soften them? That is what makes the rivalry testable rather than rhetorical. And as we'll see when we get to the evidence, the leader settled below his own stated threats, with no evident penalty. That pattern is hard for audience cost theory and comfortable for the polyheuristic reading. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. First, the hypotheses. Let me make those competing ideas falsifiable, because a hypothesis you can't disprove isn't doing scientific work. I derive 4. Hypothesis 1, from the rational cost model, concessions should move continuously and proportionally with marginal oil market cost. As the price rises a little, the concession adjusts a little, a smooth curve. Hypothesis 2, the polyheuristic claim, the war option is eliminated discontinuously, on a domestic political dimension, before any fine-grained cost-benefit weighing. Note the key word, discontinuously. Not a smooth adjustment but a step, a categorical removal of an option once a threshold is crossed. Hypothesis 3, from group dynamics, advisory fragmentation should produce observable inconsistency in bargaining positions, mixed signals, shifting deadlines. Hypothesis 4, the audience cost rival, prior public threats should harden terms and raise the leader's cost of settling. Here's the elegant tension I want you to hold on to. Hypotheses 1 and 2 both predict that oil prices matter. Both are, in a sense, economic stories. But they predict different shapes. H1 predicts a smooth, proportional response. H2 predicts a discontinuous step. So the shape of the response discriminates between them. That's going to be the analytical hinge of the whole paper. And hypothesis 4 predicts the opposite of hypothesis 2 on the direction of the terms, hardening versus softening. So the hypotheses aren't just a list, they're engineered to cut against each other. When evidence supports one, it actively undermines another. That's what lets the case adjudicate rather than merely accommodate. Designing hypotheses that genuinely compete is half the methodological battle, and it's where a lot of case study work quietly falls short. A word on method, because the credibility of everything rests on it. I use two tools in combination. The first is structured, focused comparison, in the tradition of Alexander George. Structured means the same theory-derived questions are put to every model, no special pleading, no moving the goalposts from one theory to the next. Focused means I examine only the aspects of the crisis that bear on this specific decision, rather than narrating everything. The second tool is process tracing, asking whether the causal process observations, the fingerprints a mechanism would leave inside the case, are actually consistent with each model's story. And to keep process tracing honest, I use Stephen Van Evera's typology of tests, which you can think of as a ladder of evidentiary strength. At the bottom, the straw in the wind test. Passing it nudges your belief slightly. It's weakly probative either way. Next, the hoop test. This one is necessary but not sufficient. The theory must jump through the hoop to stay alive. Fail a hoop test and the explanation dies. Then, the smoking gun test. This is sufficient but not necessary. Pass it and the case for that mechanism is strong, even if failing it wouldn't kill the theory. And at the top, rare and powerful, the doubly decisive test, which both confirms one explanation and eliminates its rivals at once. The whole point of this apparatus is discipline. Each model gets assigned the specific observation that would disconfirm it. No model is allowed to merely fit the story after the fact. If a theory can't tell me in advance what evidence would prove it wrong, it doesn't belong in the analysis. Here's the scorecard of tests laid out explicitly. What would prove each model wrong? This table is, in a sense, the spine of the paper, so let me read its logic. For the rational actor model, the predicted observation is that concessions track marginal oil costs smoothly. The test type is a straw in the wind, and what would disconfirm it is a discontinuous jump unrelated to marginal cost. For bureaucratic politics, The predicted observation is factional cleavage and compromise visible in the terms. The test is a smoking gun, and it's disconfirmed by a unitary preference with no factional traces. For prospect theory, we'd expect gain frame torque paired with risk-averse lock-in. That's a straw test, disconfirmed by loss frame paired with risk-seeking behavior. For polyheuristic theory, the prediction is that the war option was screened out politically before cost-benefit weighing. The test is a hoop leading to a smoking gun, and, this is critical, it's disconfirmed if the war option was actually weighed on the merits and rejected only marginally. For groupthink polythink, we'd expect public dissent, contradictory signals, delay, a hoop test, disconfirmed by unified messaging and rapid consensus. And for the audience cost rival, the prediction is that threats harden terms and make settling costly, a hoop test, disconfirmed if the leader settles below the threat at no cost. Notice that every single row has a clear failure condition stated in advance. That's what makes this analysis testable rather than just a flattering narrative. When we get to the evidence, we're checking these predictions, not improvising explanations. Keep this table in the back of your mind, we'll be returning to its verdicts. Let me ground all this theory in the actual sequence of events, because the chronology itself carries analytical weight. 5 phases over roughly 5 months. Phase 1, the 28th of February, the strikes begin. The supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, is killed, and Iran responds by closing the Strait of Hormuz, the maritime choke point that will drive everything economic that follows. Phase 2, the 19th of March, the United States launches an air campaign aimed at reopening the strait. Phase 3, the 8th of April, Pakistan brokers a 2-week ceasefire, the first off-ramp. But then, on the 11th and 12th of April, direct US-Iran talks in Islamabad, the highest-level engagement since 1979, failed to produce a peace agreement. Phase 4, the 13th of April, a US naval blockade and mutual seizures. The pressure is now maximal and mutual. And Phase 5, the 28th to 29th of May, a tentative 60-day memorandum of understanding takes shape, and it's placed before the president in that Situation Room meeting. Now, here's what I want you to notice about the timing, and it matters for the testing ahead. The settlement does not come at the moment of maximum military leverage. It doesn't come when the blockade bites hardest in purely military terms. It comes as the oil price and domestic cost pressure peaks. The economic clock and the diplomatic clock are synchronized, the military clock is not. Each phase here is tagged by evidence tier in the paper, and single source internals are hedged. But the spine of the sequence, strikes, closure, campaign, blockade, ceasefire, is firmly established. Hold that synchronization in mind. This is the single most important chart in the entire study, so let me sit with it. On the vertical axis, Brent crude in dollars per barrel. Along the horizontal, the months of the crisis. The story the line tells is dramatic. We start at a pre-war baseline of about $72. Then the strikes land, Hormuz closes, and the price climbs to $101 to $113, holding high through the blockade, and ultimately spiking, by mid-May, to a 4-year high near $126. That is roughly a 76% jump above the pre-war baseline at the peak. A note on the numbers, because honesty about data matters. This is an approximate trajectory reconstructed from benchmark levels reported by named financial wires, not tick-level pricing, so treat the figures as the shape of the move, not as decimal precise readings. And then, as a settlement appears near, it retreats toward the mid-90s. Now look at the 3 stat cards beside the chart, because they translate barrels into politics. Plus 76%, Brent above baseline at the peak. $4.30. The price per gallon of gasoline, a 4-year high, at the American pump. And roughly 20 million barrels a day, the volume that normally moves through the Strait of Hormuz, about a fifth of world petroleum. Here is why this chart is the engine of the case and not mere background. In a tight oil market with little spare capacity and no redundant route around Hormuz, a choke point closure doesn't stay offshore. It reprices into every American gas tank within weeks. The disruption is not abstract or diplomatic. It is felt, concretely and immediately, by tens of millions of voters. That immediacy is precisely the mechanism the polyheuristic account needs. Hold that thought, felt, immediate, domestic cost. We'll see what it does to the menu of options. Let me show you the physical reality underneath that price spike, because it explains why the market reacted so violently. This chart shows transit volume through the Strait of Hormuz as a percentage of the 2025 baseline. Normal flow is the 100% bar on the left. Then watch the collapse. By March, throughput is down to about 22% of normal. By April, 6%. By late May, around 5%. The choke point very nearly closed. And here's the thing that makes this matter: there is no redundant sea route out of the Gulf. What does not pass through Hormuz is not simply rerouted around it the way traffic flows around a closed highway. It is delayed, it is rerouted by long and costly overland alternatives where those even exist, or it is repriced. And in a tight global market, repricing means a shock that reaches every American gas pump. Compare this, and I'll develop this comparison fully later, to the tanker war of the 1980s, the same choke point, attacks on shipping, repeated Iranian threats to close the strait. But in the 1980s the global market was slack, awash in spare supply from new non-OPEC fields, and the disruption was absorbed. Prices actually declined across that decade. Same geography, completely different economic consequence. So the lesson of this slide is that geography alone doesn't determine the political stakes. What determines them is the market context into which the disruption lands. In 2026, that context was unforgiving: a tight market, a vital choke point, no slack to absorb the blow. The physical collapse you see here is what converted a distant naval crisis into a kitchen table economic problem. Now let's start grading the models against the evidence, beginning with the first two. The rational actor model first. What does it get right? Quite a lot, actually. It captures the broad logic of escalation dominance and the basic sense that the leader weighed costs and benefits. We shouldn't dismiss it, but here's where it strains. It cannot explain why the hardest nuclear questions were deferred from a position of military strength. That's odd if you're simply maximizing, and, more tellingly, it cannot explain why price and concession moved in a step rather than along a smooth curve. The rational cost story predicts proportional, continuous adjustment. What we observe looks more like a threshold being crossed. So the verdict is, H1 weakened. Not refuted, weakened. The smooth curve prediction doesn't match the discontinuous reality. Now bureaucratic politics. Here the evidence is more favorable. There's a clear accommodationist versus hawk cleavage in the advisory system, and the eventual framework bears the marks of compromise, the kind of split the difference structure that each faction could partly claim as a win. That's exactly the fingerprint bureaucratic politics predicts, and it passes its smoking gun test. So, supported. But notice a limit even here. The decisive go, no-go judgment seems to have clustered around the principal himself, not diffused across the bureaucracy. So bureaucratic politics explains the texture of the terms, the compromises and the hedges, better than it explains the core stop or go decision. Two models down, one weakened, one supported but bounded. Neither yet reaches the heart of the puzzle. Why stop at all, from a position of strength? For that we need the next pair. Models 3 and 4. Prospect theory first. The evidence here is genuinely interesting but ultimately only weakly probative. You can see framing oscillate. There's a domain of gains narrative, Iran backed down, we won, and there's a domain of losses narrative, the oil shock and its mounting costs. At the decisive moment, the gain frame appears to win, and the leader locks in the win rather than gambling for more, which is consistent with risk aversion in the domain of gains. So far so good for prospect theory. But here's the problem: that very same behavior is equally consistent with poliheuristic screening. Locking in the win and avoiding the costly gamble of indefinite war is exactly what you'd expect if the war option had already been eliminated on domestic political grounds. Two theories predict the same observable, so the observable can't discriminate between them. That's why prospect theory rates only as weakly supported. It passes a straw in the win test, nothing stronger. Now group dynamics. The signature here is not excessive cohesion, it's fragmentation. Principles aired disagreement in public, signals shifted within hours, deadlines were set and then postponed. That's not groupthink, it's classic polythink. And notice what polythink does. It degraded the coherence of the bargaining position but, paradoxically, it widened the option set. More voices kept more possibilities on the table. So the verdict is supported, specifically as polythink rather than groupthink. Step back and you can feel the analysis converging. Each model captures something real: texture, framing, signaling pathology. But none of the four we've examined so far cleanly explains the central fact: the categorical removal of the war option from a winning position. That's the gap the fifth model is built to fill. This is the analytical crux of the entire paper, so let me slow right down. We have two economic explanations that both say oil prices mattered, the rational cost story, H1, and the polyheuristic story, H2. They agree that the oil shock is central. The question is, how did it operate? And they make genuinely different predictions about shape, language, and timing. Look at the two columns. On the left, H1, rational cost. It predicts a smooth, proportional flexibility. Each increment of price buys a corresponding increment of concession. The choice is reversible if prices fall back. And the justification, if you could hear it, would be framed in strategic terms, costs and benefits, marginal calculation. On the right, H2, non-compensatory screening. It predicts a categorical step, not a slope. The war option is removed wholesale once the price spike holds past a threshold. It's insensitive to fine marginal calculation. Doubling the pain doesn't double the response, because the option is simply off the table. And the justification is framed in political terms, what the public will tolerate, not strategic ones. So which pattern do we actually observe? The observed pattern is the step. The concession had a categorical, threshold quality, the language leaned political, the war option seems to have been removed rather than continuously priced. That's why H2 is supported and H1 is weakened. But, and I want to be scrupulously honest here, H1 is weakened, not eliminated. Rational calculation plausibly still governs the choice among the options that survived the first cut. The two-stage structure means both can be partly true. Politics screens, then reason optimizes within the survivors. That nuance matters for what comes next. Now let's deal with the strongest rival, audience cost theory, because a contribution is only as credible as the alternative it defeats. Recall the prediction. The president had publicly demanded that Iran never acquire a nuclear weapon and that the Strait of Hormuz reopen toll-free. Audience cost logic says that having made those public commitments, the leader should be trapped, unable to settle for less without paying a serious political price for the visible climb down. Public threats are supposed to tie your hands. That's the whole mechanism. So what actually happened? The framework deferred the core enrichment question. It did not extract the categorical nuclear guarantee that had been demanded. It exchanged no immediate relief. And critically, it was framed domestically as a win, with no evident political penalty, partly by moving the goalposts, redefining success after the fact. The leader settled below his own stated threats and was not punished for it. That is the disconfirming observation for audience cost theory as a primary driver. The hands were supposed to be tied, and they weren't. Now, I want to be fair to the rival. Audience cost logic is not wholly absent here. The insistence on face-saving conditions, the public line that no money would be exchanged, is exactly what you'd expect from a leader managing his domestic audience. So this isn't a knockout, it's a weakening. But as the primary engine of the decision, audience cost predicts the wrong sign. Audience cost theory and polyheuristic theory point in opposite directions on the terms. Audience cost says public commitment should push terms up, toward hardening. The polyheuristic plus oil story says domestic economic pain pushes terms down, toward settlement. The terms went down, so the same evidence that weakens the rival fits the favored account, about as close as a single case gets to one body of evidence cutting two ways at once, though I'd stop short of calling it strictly doubly decisive given how much rests on inference. H4 is the rival the evidence weakens. Let me consolidate all the verdicts in one scorecard, because I want you to see that this analysis is deliberately uneven, and that unevenness is a sign of honesty, not weakness. Reading down, the rational actor model is weakened, it fails on the smooth curve prediction. Bureaucratic politics passes its smoking gun test, supported. Prospect theory passes only a straw in the wind, weakly supported. Polyheuristic theory passes a hoop and a smoking gun, it's the strongest performer. Groupthink polythink passes its hoop, supported. And the audience cost rival fails its hoop test outright, not supported. Here's what I want you to take from the overall shape. No model passes everything. A rational cost reading is weakened but not destroyed. A serious rival fails. The favored theory, polyheuristic, is the strongest, but, as the very next slide will show, it carries its own genuine risk of failure. If every model had passed, or if my favored theory had swept the board, you should be suspicious. That's usually the signature of a story being fitted after the fact rather than tested. The unevenness here, with one model weakened, one failed, and the rest supported to varying degrees, is what testing actually looks like when you let the evidence push back. Notice the asterisk on poliheuristic, non-compensatory hoop unresolved. I put that there on purpose, and I'm not going to hide it. The favored explanation has a soft spot, and intellectual integrity requires me to walk you straight into it rather than around it. This slide is where I try to earn your trust, by attacking my own favored explanation as hard as I can. Polyheuristic theory passes the tests keyed to timing and justification, the observable step, the political language, the synchronization with the price peak. But its defining claim is stronger and more demanding than politics mattered. Its central claim is that the war option was screened out non-compensatorily, that is, eliminated on a domestic political dimension before and irrespective of any weighing of its strategic costs and benefits. Eliminate first, then optimize. And here's the hoop that I cannot yet cleanly clear. The internal sequencing of the 29th of May deliberation is unobserved. It's a closed-door, Tier 5 matter. And the outcome we can see is equally consistent with two different stories. Story 1, genuine non-compensatory screening, the option taken off the table categorically. Story 2, an ordinary cost-benefit rejection in which the war option was weighed on its merits against the oil costs and rejected, just with a very heavy weight on the domestic dimension. Both stories produce the same visible step. So what would disconfirm my reading? Meeting records, or principals testimony, showing that the war option was explicitly traded at the margin against oil costs. If that evidence emerged, it would refute not merely the strength of the polyheuristic account but its central claim. That's why I downgrade the verdict from strongly supported to supported but falsifiable. I'd rather state the vulnerability plainly than oversell. A theory that can't tell you how it might be wrong isn't science, and the favored theory here can tell you exactly how it might be wrong. Let me also be honest about the comparison I leaned on earlier, the within-actor contrast with the 2018 TO2020 maximum pressure campaign. It's valuable, but it has confounds, and a careful analyst names them. 3 problems. First, different personnel. The 2018 TO2020 team was, on the whole, more uniformly hawkish. So a difference in outcome between then and now could reflect a change in advisors rather than a change in cost structure. Personnel is a competing explanation. Second, a decapitation shock. The 2026 episode followed the killing of the supreme leader, an extraordinary event with no real analogue in the earlier period. That alone could account for a great deal of the behavioral difference, independent of oil. Third, a shifted baseline. The 2026 decision came after, not before, a major use of force. The bargaining starting point was completely different. You're negotiating down from war, not threatening up from sanctions. So the same leader, yes, but a changed environment on at least 3 dimensions. That weakens any clean inference from the within-actor comparison alone. Now, here's the fix, and it's what good comparative design demands. To isolate the variable I actually care about, cost structure, I need a case where leader, personnel, and shock all differ, but the choke point stays constant. If cost structure still does the explanatory work when everything else varies, that's far more convincing than holding the leader fixed. So the confounds in the within-actor comparison aren't a dead end. They're a signpost pointing to the case I turn to next, a case from a different decade entirely, with a different cast, but the very same strait. This is the comparison that, to my mind, clinches the theoretical argument, and it's an out-of-actor case, the tanker war of 1984 to 1988. Look at the chart. 3 cases along the bottom, the tanker war of the 1980s, the maximum pressure campaign of 2018 TO2020, and the Iran war of 2026. 2 bars for each, on an analyst-coded ordinal index. The lighter bar is the concentrated, immediate cost to the US public, and the darker bar is the resulting domestic pressure to settle. Now read across. The 2026 case on the right, both bars are high, 9 and 8.5. Concentrated cost, intense settlement pressure. But the tanker war on the left, low on both, 2.5 and 2. And this is the crucial part. The tanker war had identical geography to 2026, the same Strait of Hormuz, the same attacks on shipping, the same repeated Iranian threats to close it. Yet a slack global oil market in the 1980s, flush with new non-OPEC supply, simply absorbed the disruption. Crude averaged around $20 a barrel. The cost to the American public was diffuse, and there was no settlement pressure, no domestic deadline. The US presence persisted for over a year at low political cost. So here's the inference the within-actor comparison alone could never give us. The choke point was constant across these cases. The leader, the personnel, the era, all different. What varied, and what tracks the settlement pressure, is the cost structure, whether the disruption imposed concentrated, immediate pain or diffuse, absorbable cost. Same strait, opposite outcome. It is the cost structure, not the geography and not the leader's identity, that drives the deadline. So let me state the contribution, the generalizable proposition this case yields, which is the part one most want you to carry away. Here it is. The domestic political sustainability of a coercive instrument depends on whether its costs to the coercer's own public are diffuse and deferred, or concentrated and immediate. Read that again with the two scenarios in mind. When the cost of coercion is diffuse and deferred, coercion is self-sustaining. The 1980s choke point in a slack market is the example. The pain was spread thin and pushed into the future, so there was no domestic deadline, and the pressure campaign could simply continue. But when the cost is concentrated and immediate, coercion is self-limiting. An energy choke point crisis in a tight market is the example. The pain lands on identifiable people, right now, at the gas pump, and that builds a domestic deadline into the very instrument you're using. The coercive tool contains the seed of its own time limit. Notice what this proposition does. It relocates the explanation for why coercion succeeds or fails away from the adversary, away from the enemy's resolve or capabilities, and toward the coercer's own domestic political economy. The thing that stopped the war wasn't Iran's strength. It was the structure of the cost that the war imposed on the American public. And notice, too, that this proposition does not depend on how the 2026 case ultimately resolves. Even if the settlement collapses, the logic, diffuse cost sustains, concentrated cost limits, stands on the comparative evidence across three cases and on its own internal coherence. Let me place this contribution in the scholarly conversation, because a proposition matters more when you can see exactly what it adds to what we already knew. Two giants frame the field. Thomas Schelling, in 1966, gave us the manipulation of risk and pain as bargaining, coercion as the art of making an adversary fear what comes next. Alexander George, in 1991, gave us the conditions under which coercive diplomacy succeeds or fails, the careful catalogue of when threats work. Both are foundational, but notice what they share. Both treat the coercer as a single bearer of resolve, a unitary will that either has the stomach for escalation or doesn't. The coercer is essentially one actor with one level of determination. What this paper adds is a look inside that coercer, specifically, inside the coercer's own polity. The argument is that the distribution of coercion's cost within the coercing society is itself a structural variable that neither framework theorizes. Schelling asks whether you can make the adversary hurt. George asks under what conditions your threat is credible. Neither asks what your own instrument is doing to your own electorate, and how that feeds back into your ability to keep using it. And here's the one-line version, the sentence I'd want to survive if everything else were forgotten. Military superiority does not become bargaining leverage when the instrument of dominance visibly punishes your own electorate. The means of winning can dismantle the political will to keep winning. That's an amendment, not a refutation. It sits on top of Schelling and George and adds the missing domestic cost dimension to a theory that has, for 60 years, looked mostly outward at the adversary. Let me close honestly, with both the limits and the takeaway, because a conclusion that only sells is a conclusion you shouldn't trust. The limits, plainly stated. First, the explanation is inferred, the meeting's internals are unobserved, and so the decisive mechanism rests on reconstruction, not direct access. Second, the favored model remains falsifiable on its central claim. As I showed you, non-compensatory screening versus heavily weighted rational calculation is not yet resolvable on the present record. Third, the out-of-actor tanker war case differs in era and market, not only in cost structure, so it's a strong illustration of the logic rather than a perfectly controlled experiment. And fourth, single-case design inherently limits generalization. One case, however rich, can establish plausibility and propose a mechanism, but it cannot by itself confirm a law. Now the takeaway, holding all that in view. The best reading of this decision is a nested process, not a single cause. A domestic political filter, the oil shock, bounded the choice set, taking indefinite war off the table. Within that bounded set, Cognitive framing and bureaucratic bargaining shaped the particular terms that emerged. And polythink degraded the execution and the signaling along the way. Layered, not monocausal, but the headline, the thing that did the heaviest lifting, is this: the instrument that delivered rapid military dominance, war across the world's most important oil choke point, in a tight market, generated the very domestic deadline that drove the United States to the negotiating table. The weapon created the clock. The means of dominance manufactured the pressure to stop. That's the argument. Let me leave you with the Throcklin in 3 sentences. A president holding overwhelming military advantage chose to convert it into diplomacy, and the best explanation is not strategy or reputation but domestic political economy. What a concentrated, immediate oil shock does to the sustainability of a war inside a democracy. The general lesson is that the durability of any coercive instrument turns on who bears its cost. Diffuse and deferred costs sustain coercion, while concentrated and immediate costs make it self-limiting. And the amendment to a 60-year tradition is simply this: to understand whether coercion will hold, don't only look at the adversary. Look at what the instrument is doing to the coercer's own people. I've tried throughout to be candid about what's solid and what's inferred, to test the favored theory against its strongest rival, and to hand you a diagnostic test that my own preferred explanation could still fail. That's the posture I think this kind of work demands: confident about the events, disciplined about the explanation, and honest about the edges. Thank you for your attention. The full paper develops each of these tests in detail, with the evidence tiers and citations laid out, and I genuinely welcome questions and discussion, especially challenges to the cost structure proposition, which is where I think the most interesting work remains to be done. Thank you. Thanks for watching. If you found this valuable, subscribe and hit the bell for more analysis on geopolitics and global affairs. See you in the next one.